Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jack Kiruja from the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, and I take this opportunity to welcome you to our second in a series of 3 webinars on district heating and cooling. And more specifically, we'll be looking at the integration of low temperature renewable energy sources into district heating and cooling networks. For those who are not familiar with IRENA, it's an intergovernmental organization that supports countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future. And it does this by promoting the widespread adoption and sustainable use of all forms of renewable energy, such as geothermal, solar, wind, among others. For today's webinar, you can listen in through your computer by selecting the mic and speaker option on the right-hand pane on your screen, or alternatively, you can choose to listen in by telephone by selecting the telephone option on the right-hand pane and entering the phone number and the PIN that appears. In case you experience any technical difficulties, please do not hesitate to contact our GoToWebinar help desk on the number showed on your screen. We also encourage you to actively participate in the webinar by asking questions, and this you can do by typing in your question on the question pane that is on the right-hand side of your screen. At the end of the webinar, we would like to receive your feedback on what you think about the webinar, and please do this by responding to the questionnaire that appears when you end the webinar. If you'd like to watch this webinar at a later date or share it with others, we are going to have the recording on the IRENA YouTube channel, as well as on the website of the Global Geothermal Alliance. The presentations that are going to be used today will also be made available. Now, this series of webinar consists of 3 series, and for today's webinar, we are going to be looking at the second, which is on the enabling framework conditions for district energy networks for heating and cooling. And these include the ownership models, regulations, and financing. The last webinar, which was the first webinar, which took place on the 20th of April, the focus was on strategic heating and cooling planning for district energy networks that operate using low temperature renewable energy sources. And for our last webinar, the focus will be on overcoming the technical challenges of integrating low temperature renewables into existing district energy networks and buildings. The agenda for today is that we're going to have 4 presentations, which will be divided into 2 parts. The first part will comprise of 2 presentations, and it will be followed by a question and answer session. Then the second part is going to have 2 presentations, which will also be followed by a question and answer session. And we encourage you to participate by sending in your questions, and then we will direct them to the right panelists to respond. Now, these are the panelists for today who are going to take us through the various sections of this webinar. And to begin this webinar, I'm going to give a brief introduction of the project, as well as the rationale of why we are doing this project. So this project is these webinars are part of a wider IRENA project known as Energy Solutions for Cities of the Future, a project that seeks to decarbonize energy supply in the cities and also to decarbonize the end-use sectors. The project is supported by the government of Germany through the International Climate Initiative, ICI. The district heating component of this project is being implemented jointly by IRENA and the Aalborg University in the framework of the Global Geothermal Alliance. The Alliance is an initiative of IRENA that seeks to enhance cooperation, dialogue, and coordinated action among the stakeholders in the geothermal sector, both from the government or the public sector and from the private sector. The objective is to attract financing in the geothermal development so that so as to accelerate the deployment of geothermal for both electricity generation and for direct uses, including district heating and cooling. In the framework of the Global Geothermal Alliance, the members and partners have contributed to guiding IRENA and Aalborg University to develop a guidebook for policymakers on district heating and cooling through a practitioner group of district heating and cooling professionals drawn not only from the Alliance, but also from other organizations. The guidebook for policymakers seeks to increase the knowledge of policymakers at the national government level and at the local government levels on the options and tools that are available for enabling the integration of low temperature renewables into district heating and cooling networks. Now, when you take a closer look at the energy sector, what we see is that about 2/3 of the energy that is generated today is utilized in the context of cities. And about 50% of all this energy is used for heating and cooling. When you take a closer look at the residential sector, the graph on the right, we can see that space heating, space cooling, water heating take up the vast majority of the energy that is used in the building sector. But unfortunately, most of this energy is supplied using fossil fuels, leading to emissions and pollution. Another thing that is important to note is that most of the heating and cooling is supplied using individual standalone fossil-based heating systems, which have inherent inefficiencies in their operation. We also note that as the population of the world continues to grow and more people move into the cities, we are going to have an increase in demand for energy for heating and cooling in the cities. And if we continue using fossil fuels, the result is that we're going to have more emissions and more pollution. Therefore, it's important to take measures in order to reduce the pollution, to reduce the carbon emissions, and also to have a secure source of energy for heating and cooling. And to be able to do this, some actions are needed. These include first, to improve the energy efficiency of buildings so that the buildings we're going to use less energy, and this will result in less of the fossil fuels being burnt for heat generation. Then the second step is that we need to start replacing the fossil fuels with locally available renewable energy sources. Now, an interesting thing about the locally available renewable energy sources is that most of them happen to fall in the category of low temperature resources, which have temperatures of below 70. And these include the low temperature geothermal, solar thermal, and waste heat from industrial processes and also from cooling operations. Now, for us to be able to efficiently use the low temperature renewable energy sources, then we need to have a district heating and cooling system in place so that this energy can be tapped and used for heating and cooling. However, the first problem that we encounter with this is that most of the available district heating and cooling networks were not designed to operate with low temperature resources. But however, we notice that there has been an evolution of district heating systems starting from the first generation, which were characterized by high temperature, by high supply temperature, to the current fourth generation district heating networks, which are characterized by the use of low temperature resources, such as the locally available renewables. And to address these challenges, together with other challenges that we encounter when making the transition from fossil fuels to renewables in district heating, the webinars look at these from four main focus areas. The first one is on strategic heating and cooling planning, which looks at identifying the locally available renewable energy sources and matching them with the demand for heating and cooling. Then we look at the compatibility of the existing buildings and the existing district energy networks with the low temperature renewable resources. And where possible, we make renovations so that we can so as to achieve the compatibility. The third aspect is on enabling framework conditions which are necessary for which need to be put in place so that the district energy networks running on low temperature resources can be developed. And finally, we're going to look at the technology specific challenges and solutions for integrating different sources of energy into the energy networks. And now taking a closer look at the enabling frameworks and comparing them across different sectors, we see that a vast majority of the enabling frameworks have been developed for the power sector. And this can be reflected in the statistic that we see for energy today, whereby 72% of the electricity that was generated in 2019 was from renewable energy sources, representing about 176 gigawatts of electricity. However, when you look at the heating and cooling sector, we see that only a few enabling frameworks have been developed. And again, this is reflected in the statistics, where in 2017, we find that only 8% of the energy for heating and cooling was derived from renewable energy sources. However, according to the Global Renewable Outlook by IRENA, there's potential that this could rise by up to 77% by the year 2050 if the right enabling frameworks are put in place. And to see what enabling frameworks need to be put in place, we are going to have the other presenters talking about the different options and the different enabling frameworks that need to be put in place. And for our first presentation, we are going to have Mr. Soren Jorup from the Aalborg University. Soren is an assistant professor in the Sustainable Energy Planning Research Group at Aalborg University, and is a specialist on economics and political aspects of the transition to renewable energy systems. His presentation today will be on the ownership structures, financing, and regulations for district heating and cooling. So, Mr. Soren, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you for the introduction, and also thank you for hosting this session. I just turn my screen on here. Okay, I hope that you can see my screen. Yes, as Jack mentioned, I'll be talking about the regulatory aspects of district heating. One thing I would like to mention here in the introduction is that often Danes like me, we talk about district heating in an international context because we have a lot of experience with district heating in Denmark and in Scandinavia, a lot of good experiences. And often it's easy to talk about technical solutions in an international context because technology doesn't really change character when you cross a country border. Whereas when you talk about these issues of regulation, price regulation, and so on, because it can sometimes be a bit more difficult because every time you cross a country border, you also enter a new cultural tradition and a new political context. But nonetheless, I'll try to highlight some central aspects based on primarily Danish experiences, but also add some others. And I'll try to also, for this reason, try to abstract from the very detailed content, but try to focus on what are kind of the main considerations and what are the main challenges that you need to address in your local regulation and the organization of the sector. So the outline for this presentation is that I will just briefly recap why should we talk about district heating and why should we do it now. and also briefly address where should we build district heating systems. And then the major part of my presentation will focus on the question how district heating. So I will talk about ownership models, price regulation, and so on. So sometimes you hear this question, can we afford to build district heating? Is it costly for society to do this? And there I just want to highlight that from, if you take like this kind of macroeconomic perspective, then at least in many countries we have currently low interest rates, we have no shortages of labor. Many countries import fuels, which can be a burden for the local and national economies. We have a CO2 crisis, and we also have in urban environments, we have many places we have air pollution problems. So the conditions for building district heating in these years are very good, both economically and politically, you could say. And of course, I think these 5 points have not been less relevant during this corona situation. So why and when, these are reasons why we should do it, and when should we do it? We should do it now. And then the question, where should we build district heating? And here I think it's important to highlight that we base our district heating development on a procedure where we identify what we call socioeconomic viable district heating areas. I think it's an important basis for also the price regulation and the regulatory measures, that it is founded on a very good and solid analysis of socioeconomic viability. Because it can be necessary to use some rather strong regulatory measures, and in order to legitimize these regulations, it is important that the foundation of these systems is good, and it's based on a very solid analysis of where is it viable. And luckily we have some tools and reports and a lot of knowledge to support this process. For example, for European countries, we have the European Framework for Comprehensive Assessment of Heating and Cooling, so that could be one context to do it. And we also have a lot of tools being developed to support these analyses. And then a suggestion is also to based on these types of analyses, you can implement zoning policies where in specific urban areas you point these out as areas for district heating where it is, we say, economically viable. And also in relation to that, I think then the national governments have a important role here to outline heating regulation, which creates the basis for district heating, and of course also initiate this process I just mentioned before, and also outline in this legislation what is the overall role of district heating systems. Just as an example, I here show you the aim of the Danish Heat Supply Act, where it's quite directly stress that the purpose of district heating systems is to improve environmental and socioeconomic conditions. And that is also the purpose of district heating systems in general from a societal perspective. Then actually the regulation relevant for district heating and the heating sector can be quite complex, because it's not only about local heating project, but it also relates to national legislation, EU legislation, international legislations, and it also is not only situated in the heating sector, but it's also what happens in the building sector and the energy sector as such is also has a great impact on the heating sector. But what I'll focus on now in this presentation is the ownership structure of the district heating systems and the price regulation that are designed for this monopoly supply. So what are the regulatory challenges for this? It depends on what perspective you have. If you have a company perspective, then the regulation of the district heating sector must address that you will have a high upfront capital cost, which then means that you need a long-term perspective in your investment plans. And you also need to cover the risk which are associated with these long-term investments and the high capital cost. And then, of course, also you will need access to capital, preferably a cheap capital. But if you change perspective from society or for citizens, then the regulation need to ensure that consumers are protected and can accept the systems, because it is a monopoly structure. At least the grids are monopolies. And also, which I think is important, it's not only about cheap prices. It also, you need the ability to do long-term strategic energy planning. So it is important that you have some companies which are able to cooperate with city county or city authorities, and also cooperate with national decarbonization policies and so on. So when addressing these priorities, I also think it's important that we broaden our perspective. So this figure shows different basic types of governance strategies, and often we're used to only look at what you call market regulation or market power. So here, then the consumers can control the supply system through the buying power in the market. So, for example, if I don't like the coffee at the cafe, I can just go to another cafe and buy my coffee. This is not so a very strong strategy or measure in the district heating system, because the grids are monopoly, so you don't really have any alternative to the one grid which is in the city. Then, of course, you can have some state regulative power, which of course also should be used here in this case. But then also a third option, which I think is important, or at least have been proven to be important in Denmark, is the ownership power. So you can also control systems by through ownership models. This simple figure try to illustrate this trade-off between consumer protection and investor protection. Well, one solution to handle the risk for the investor and the company is to introduce this obligation to connect. So, for example, we say within a certain area in an urban area, all households are obliged to connect to the grid. So by this kind of legislation, you ensure that the risk is covered for the investor, and then they are able to invest in the system. But of course, if you do that, you only strengthen the monopoly even further. So you need to counterbalance these kind of initiatives or this kind of legislation with a strong price regulation, which then introduce consumer protection. So my recommendation will be that you go for the solution, the green circle, where you combine the obligation to connect within specific zones And here it's also important that these zones are based on this socioeconomic analysis, which I mentioned in the beginning, to make it legitimate. But then you combine this obligation with a strong price regulation, and it is important that you have a well-functioning price regulation, because that strong price regulation is the mechanism that enables the investments. Of course, you can also have no free connection and no price regulation, but then I respect it will not likely that it's not likely that the systems will be built. When you consider price regulation, I think it is important to put this into perspective of ownership regulation. So in the left column, I have 3 basic types of price regulation. So you can have what we call true cost, which is a regulation where you can only charge a price for the heat which corresponds to the cost of producing it. So basically, there's no profits in the system. And then you can have a price cap regulation, which maybe allow a certain degree of profit, controlled profit. And then, of course, the third option is to have no price regulation. And then you can have different types of ownership, and here I outline the consumer ownership, a public ownership, for example, municipality ownership, and of course also you can say the normal market solution, a private commercial ownership. In the Danish context, we have good experiences with combining true cost regulation with consumer ownership and public ownership. The majority of companies in Denmark is owned by consumers, and then in the larger cities, they are owned by municipalities. And then there's been a few cases of private commercial ownership, which has proven not to function very well together with the true cost price regulation. So an important point here is that when we consider price regulation, you always need to consider it together with our ownership regulation. The price cap principle is that you use state regulative power and try to use that to regulate the price. So we set a certain cap that you are allowed to earn. The benefits of this solution is that it means that you potentially, maybe you can, if you want to attract a broader range of investors, maybe private investors, then that could, at least in theory, can be a solution, because you allow them to earn a profit on their investment. The challenges of this regulation is that it can be difficult to practice this state regulation, because the regulator it will be difficult for a regulator to monitor the real company costs, because you need to monitor those to calculate the allowed return on the investment. And thereby, in practice, it can be difficult for a regulator to determine a so-called fair price, or at least it will require a lot of resources from a very strong state authority to control this kind of price system. But I know that it has been applied some places, and I think the experiences are both good and bad. So I guess it can be done, but it can also be difficult. An alternative is this true cost pricing, which has been applied in Denmark. And the basic principle is that the profits cannot be transferred out of the company, out of the district heating company, but all only have profit if you reinvest it in the system and use it to develop the system, or alternatively you pay a surplus, you pay it back to the consumers. So some people also call this type of regulation a consumer profit regulation, because all profits are transferred back to the consumers. The benefits of this is that it keeps the prices low. it promotes consumer acceptance, and also ensures that you always have capital for maintaining and improving the grid, because the money cannot leave the company unless it goes to the consumers. The challenges are shown to be that it is also very difficult to regulate if the interest of the regulated, so the company, if they don't have the same interests as a regulator, because again it is difficult for the regulator to monitor the true costs. So you need a company ownership structure that also have the same interest for it really to work. And therefore also it leads to the same point as before, at the ownership structure is a very important part of the price regulation. In a traditional market economy, and in a traditional markets, we usually have this sort of regulation where you have a company which is partly regulated by the state through some rules which they apply to the market, and then you have some consumers who can then use their buying power, and in between these two regulative powers, the company then operates, and are kept in check by both consumers and state. So these mechanisms, the purpose of these is that it checks the company, because the incentives are not aligned across these three levels. But the challenge then for our district heating company is, because they are monopolies, we don't have the buying power from the consumers. So this traditional market economy regulation is weakened. So one solution could be to have municipal-owned companies where you have a structure as illustrated, that you the municipality owns a separate company, and the consumers have an indirect control over the municipality, a municipal company, through its democratic influence on the municipality or city council. And that is the basic model which is applied in the larger cities in Denmark. An alternative is that the consumers owns the company themselves. So basically, they own they elect the board, and then this board maybe appoint some staff that then runs the company, and these companies are then also placed within this true cost regulation. The strength of this consumer ownership model, at least what we have seen in Denmark, both in the heating sector but also in the electricity sector, is that interests are aligned. So the states have this, the intention of the state regulation is the same as the intention of the owners. So we don't have this conflict between owners and state. And of course, the common interest is resource efficiency, and maybe also clean energy supply, and so on. In the forthcoming guidebook that we will publish from IRENA together with AU, we also line up some different examples and cases for different ownership structures. So here are some of them. I should also add that in this simple presentation, I have not a simplified presentation. I have not differentiated between different parts of the system. But of course, you can have you see that maybe one company own the grid, and then another company or companies own the production facilities. For example, in Copenhagen, in Greater Copenhagen, you have different companies owning the distribution grids, the transmission grids, and also then other companies owning the heat supply units. So of course, you can have this kind of diversified ownership structure also. This table is just to document that the ownership factor really matters also empirically. You see in the fourth column, you have this called a change in district heating price. And then if you look at all these, what this list shows is the companies in Denmark which have been owned by the private company under the true cost regulation. And if you then go to a column with change in DH price, then the rows where you see a large negative change in prices is where ownership was changed. So, for example, when the municipality bought the company from the private owner, and what we actually saw that from 1 year to another, the heating price was decreased with even up to 50 or even more, 50% decrease in consumer prices. So this also clearly illustrates that you need to consider your ownership structure together with the price regulation, because the same price regulation can give very different prices depending on who owns the systems. So to sum up on this regulatory framework, first of all, you need a national framework for this societal infrastructure, which promotes and gives the basis for developing a socioeconomic viable district heating building. And then you need B and C price regulation and ownership structures, which have to be considered together. You cannot see these as two separate issues. And then these price regulation ownership structures should also take into account when design those, how are they likely to cooperate with the local governance and local planning for sustainable cities. And then as a last point, also of course you need a mechanism that ensures a long-term cheap financing. In Denmark, it has been a public mechanism which ensures that these companies have access to a long-term cheap financing, which of course is important to make the systems competitive. So to sum up, of course we right now have a historical necessity and also opportunity for building our district heating systems, and these expansions should be based on socioeconomic assessments, and the regulatory measures should address consumer acceptance and protection. So that means basically that you ensure that the returns on the infrastructure is not too high. And you need some mechanism that ensures that you have access to capital, and the risk associated with the systems are managed. Then also you need a company and ownership structure that enable and supports this long-term sustainable energy planning, which happens in the cities and also at the national level. Okay, thank you. That was all from my side.
Thank you very much, Soren, for that presentation and for giving us an overview of the enabling frameworks for district heating using low temperature renewable energy sources. So we are going to go to our next presentation, and this will be given by Mr. Greg Gabriel from EBRD. Mr. Greg is a principal specialist for district energy at EBRD, and he works with district energy projects across EBRD's areas of activity. His presentation will be on the opportunities and challenges for financing renewable energy and energy efficiency for district heating. So, Mr. Gabriel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jack. I believe I need to share my screen.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, you should be able to see my presentation now, hopefully.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Jack. And thank you very much to IRENA and Aalborg University for organizing this event. So, good introduction from Jack, but yes, I'm a district energy specialist at the EBRD. And I always feel the need to let people know that even though I work for a bank, I'm actually an engineer and not a banker. So today I'm going to talk to you guys about how the EBRD invests in district energy, and specifically the challenges and opportunities of how to integrate low carbon sources into district energy systems in the markets that we work in, and share a couple of case studies with you. So this is my first lockdown webinar, and I was slightly disappointed that we're not on video, because this was the first excuse I've had to wear my work clothes since we left the office. But I will just be dressed smart whilst on audio. So first of all, I'll give you some background on the EBRD. EBRD stands for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We're not exactly a household name. We're what's known as an international financial institution, an IFI, similar to the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or the African Development Bank. So we do not have any private shareholders. We're entirely owned by governments and two intergovernmental institutions. That's the EU and another IFI, the European Investment Bank. So a little bit of our history. We were established in 1991 with the original aim and focus to aid those countries in Eastern and Central Europe and the former Soviet Union as they transitioned away from communism, from planned economies, to becoming well-functioning market economies. That's our transition objective. So increasingly, this has changed over time, and we have expanded our focus. And to give you an idea of scale, last year we lent roughly 10 billion euro. Of that, just under 40% of that is what we would classify as green finance. So reducing the environmental impact in the countries that we work in is increasingly important as one of our key aims now as a bank. So, to give you an idea of the area we cover, this map shows the countries that we work in, that is countries where we can lend and invest in. You can see that this very much reflects the focus when we were founded, because it's predominantly Eastern and Central Europe and the former Soviet Union. But today we're active in over 36 countries, and our focus has shifted. You'll see there's countries in some warmer and more southern climates there, such as Turkey and surrounding the southern and eastern Mediterranean. So in the district energy space, we definitely have an interest in district cooling in addition to district heating. So in this sector specifically, we've lent and invested over 700 million euro in 60+ projects in 18 of the countries shown here. And the most recent project that we signed a deal for was in Mongolia, and it's to improve the Ulaanbaatar district heating network. So, all right, the challenge, and the key is in the title, there are challenges here. So the district energy operators in what we call the economies in transition, this is the term we use for the countries that we work in, they require quite a bit of investment in order to enable the use of these low temperature, renewable or waste energy sources. So this isn't as straightforward. There's also a challenge in Western European countries. But the way we say it is that in the areas we work in, that they may have contrasting investment needs or policy priorities. So there are some things that are still lacking in some countries, such as a lack of metering at consumer premises. There's old, or in some cases completely depreciated infrastructure, such as network infrastructure. And there's tariff policies that don't allow, for instance, for cost recovery, covering the cost of operations, or let alone funding needed improvements. And this has become even more critical in the light of the current situation with COVID-19. Governments and publicly owned district energy companies are under pressure due to shortage of government revenues, and in some areas that we work in, we see that tariff payments have been suspended for district heating companies in order to help the population in the current situation. This in turn means that investment may be put on hold. There's a risk that green or renewable priorities are not prioritized any longer, and just basic maintenance may even struggle to receive funding. So in light of the above, how do we, the EBRD, approach district energy projects and work to address these issues and achieve our objectives for the sector? So I can give you the example of how we work with what we would call a typical EBRD client. So this would be a city or a city-owned district energy company. And if we were working with them to fund improvements in their district energy network, we would normally lend directly to them on a sub-sovereign basis. So that means lending below the national government directly to the city administration, or to the company with the guarantee of the city. And these types of loans from our institution, often they have a grant alongside them. Depending on the country, this can be up to 50% from a partner donor that is interested in the aims of the project, normally improvement or reduction in carbon emissions. So we also lend to private parties or take equity stakes in certain cases where we deem it appropriate. And the funds that we would lend or invest, they would typically cover investments in the whole district heating system, from generation networks to demand side. And when you work with us, an institution like us, we will work with our clients to develop projects from feasibility through to implementation. So that's upfront preparing projects, as well as once funds are in place, working to implement projects on the ground. And I mentioned that we are a different kind of bank, and we have objectives for the sector, and we work together with policymakers in countries to try and influence positive changes in the sectors, including further uptake of renewable or low carbon sources. So some further detail on the types of financing or investment that we've done in the sector. And if you follow the diagram I have there from left to right, explains the sorts of financing or investment we have done. So the most basic, straightforward form of financing is what's known as a sovereign-backed loan. This is a loan either to the central government or to one of those, say, local government administrations. However, it has the guarantee of the national government behind it. And this is the most straightforward form of financing that can be offered. More common in the countries we work in and in this sector is lending to municipal, city governments, or city-owned utility companies, like I described previously. Another category that falls between is what we call a quasi-corporate utility loan. So in some countries, for instance, in capital cities that may have large district heating networks, the companies have operate relatively like corporate institutions, and it's possible to lend to them without the explicit guarantee of their government owners or backers. And in the private space, there is a bit more room for creativity here. So we work with developers on public-private partnerships. And when we work on projects like this, we can offer assistance with structuring deals. And then the bank's objective there is to lend funds to the winning bidder, for instance, for a concession or a PPP type arrangement. We can also do what we would say simple forms of project finance or private loans, for instance, to a company that's developing an independent heat supply to say a publicly owned network. And in some cases, we have some successful examples in the past. We can also take an equity stake in, for instance, a privatization or a newly created subsidiary, where we would invest alongside other investors with an eye that the bank would like to exit that investment at a time when their objectives have been met. And we have a fairly broad range of sizes that we could finance. So then in my time at the bank, I've worked on projects in size from 5 million to 150 million euro. Now, we want to see that the projects that we fund are achieving our aims and encouraging greener solutions. So we work with donors, and we work with ways to channel donor funds towards good projects. So we have some support programs which specifically encourage those greener solutions. And the first up is our Western Balkans focused ReadyWeb Fund. This stands for Renewable District Energy in the Western Balkans, which has been generously supported by the Austrian government. Now the fund is focused on increasing the levels of renewable or waste heat supply in district energy and building a pipeline of projects in this area that the bank can lend to. It's focused on the countries that you see listed on the screen in the Western Balkans. And in particular, this fund is aiming to increase the uptake of solar thermal based district heating systems, which we believe have an excellent opportunity in the Western Balkans. So we have a very enthusiastic fund manager by the name of Bojan Bogdanovic, who's based in Belgrade. And if anybody is on the webinar and is interested in developing projects in this area in the Western Balkans, please reach out to us, to Bojan, through the email address shown there. Another program is the flagship EBRD program for city-based infrastructure, and that's our Green Cities framework. Now, this framework has three main components. We want to see the delivery of strategy and policy support through what are known as Green City Action Plans, which are a tool that are developed between the bank and the cities that are involved in the program. We also, the main purpose of the framework is to facilitate green city infrastructure investments and encourage more to come forward that wouldn't have otherwise. Across the sectors, but you can see as well, covering district energy and renewable energy. And we also, as a part of the program, want to work with city officials to increase capacity and provide technical assistance to support those administrators to achieve green objectives in their cities. Now, to be eligible for this program, you need to be located in one of the countries I showed. You need to be a city of more than 100,000 people, and you need to work with us on what we call a trigger infrastructure project, which is a first project making significant green improvements in one of the sectors listed there. Now, working under the framework, cities qualify for additional donor support. So the Green City Action Plans I described are funded by donors. But in addition to that, if a project is prepared under the framework in one of the following countries listed there, the 9 countries, the project can be eligible for grant funding from the Green Climate Fund. So we've secured 87 million euro of funds from the Green Climate Fund. And for those who don't know, the GCF is the world's largest dedicated green fund, focused exclusively on helping developing countries. So I'd like to take the opportunity presented here to present some examples of some recent projects that we have supported achieve some of the aims I described earlier. So a recent project and a renewable one that we worked with was the Banja Luka district heating project in Bosnia. So the EBRD lent just over 8 million euro to the city of Banja Luka, which the city used to purchase equity in a new joint venture, new PPP, that was supplying district heating services in the city. The new company constructed a 49 megawatt biomass boiler plant, which replaced capacity that was previously based on heavy fuel oil, also known as mazout, and which contributed quite negatively to the city's air pollution problem. So as a result of this project, heat supply in the city has been operating for 1.5 winters now. Heat supply in the city is now over 95% renewable, and we are working with the city and the company on further projects focused on network improvement and demand side measures. And this is an example of a trigger project under the Green Cities framework. So this was the first Green Cities project in Banja Luka, which is leading on to additional projects under the framework. Now, I mentioned that we work in some of the warmer countries around the southern and eastern Mediterranean. And this is an example of some work we did in the cooling sector in Jordan. So we lent 27 million euro to the Jordan District Energy Company, which developed a new district heating and cooling system to supply a brand new development in central Amman, an entirely new development called the Abdali neighborhood. So the funds were lent to a part private special purpose vehicle that was set up, and they funded the construction of the new central plant. The total cost was around 42 million euro, and of that, we lent 27 million. So the project had some very positive environmental impacts, and for the technical people listening, I can give you a little bit of detail. So it was based upon ammonia chiller plant, and it had what at the time that it was built, it had I believe the largest thermal store for a district cooling plant, which was 80,000 cubic meters size. So the idea, which would be very familiar to those people involved in the district cooling space, is that the thermal store allowed most of the cooling demand to be met by being generated at nighttime and stored for use during the day. This had a positive impact on peak electrical demand, and there were also some special characteristics that minimized water consumption. And Amman is a water-stressed, particularly water-stressed area. Well, thank you. I'll wrap things up now. I want to say that the EBRD, we welcome interesting and challenging projects, and we're very eager to fund innovative and low carbon energy technologies and try and address the challenges that are faced for decarbonizing the heating and cooling sector. So listed some specific generations or specific forms of technology that we're interested in supporting. We see great opportunity for solar thermal and for thermal storage. And we also are eager to work with players beyond the public sector, support PPPs, and where possible or where allowable, take equity stakes or make direct investment. So thank you very much. And I look forward to the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Greg, for your presentation today. And now we are going to turn to our first question and answer session, where we are going to respond to some of the questions that we have received so far. And we encourage participants to send more questions that they may have. So the first question goes to you, Greg, and I think this you've partly addressed it. And it's being asked, is there any policy or strategy or rules for choosing which city needs the financing approach on a priority basis? And I can tie that up with a question on what would be your advice to cities and developers of district heating systems so that their project can become financially attractive to investors? So over to you, Greg.
Okay, sorry, I had left myself on mute. So yes, if there is a city or a city-owned utility that is interested in investment, has a project in mind, they need to be based in one of our 36 countries of operation, and they need to, if it's a sovereign, if it's a situation where the state would be providing a guarantee, the financial status of the city itself is less relevant, but where it's a sub-sovereign or municipal loan, the borrowing capacity of the city will come into play. And if they want to be involved in the Green Cities framework, which I described, we should be discussing projects that will have a positive environmental impact, and the specific rules around that are that it should make the investment plan should make a reduction in CO2 emissions of at least 20%. Same for air pollution or, for instance, water consumption, or it should make a positive contribution towards increased climate resilience. Now, in terms of recommendations could make to those local authorities or developers, I would say that if they want to improve their attractiveness, I would say that a willingness to commit or provide some of their own funds or equity. On the public side, this would be viewed positively, but is not entirely mandatory. For a private developer, this is a requirement for private deals, because we normally cannot fund the entire cost of a private deal. I would also say that for cities or local authorities that want that are interested, that if they're looking to they could embed the need for greener sources of heating and cooling in their development policies or their long-term development plans. And they could also lead by example. By if, for instance, they were looking to expand networks or even put in new district energy networks, they could focus first on the buildings in their direct control, such as their city administrative buildings, and make them available for connecting to district energy systems first, if they're not already. That way they could create a base load for this new or extended networks.
Thank you, Greg, for those answers. We will direct the next question to Soren, and then we will also come back again to you for some more questions I'm still receiving. So for you, Soren, the question is, what do you say to the criticism of true cost principle that it does not give any incentive to become more efficient, as is the case in Denmark?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I don't agree with this criticism. I don't think that really there's empirical evidence for this worry, you could say. But of course, there's also a context to these true cost principle regulation in Denmark, and that is, first of all, as I mentioned, that they are also consumer-owned companies. So I think the true cost principle would not work if you only had private commercial ownership. Then it could be a problem. And also I think we have some examples of that. And then another thing I think is important to highlight is that because of the ownership structure, the companies in Denmark in the different cities are very willing to cooperate and share knowledge. So that means that when you have these consumer companies, they tend to be more open, both also to universities and other industries to give open access to the systems and the data, and that creates, I think, an innovative system around the sector. So I think these concerns about efficiency and innovation and development, I think you should consider this as more as a system, an innovation system. And there I think actually Denmark is also a very good example, because you have a lot of knowledge sharing between the companies, and you have a lot of external consultants and industries in the sector, which also helps promote efficiency and development. So that was my question, or my answer to that. But I'll be also seeing that, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we're also seeing that the true cost principle cannot really be combined with a private commercial ownership. So if you have a private commercial ownership, or if you want to go for a private commercial ownership of these systems, then I think you should have another kind of regulation, maybe some kind of price cap regulation. But then again, that will also require another structure and a very strong authority to do that. And we don't have a lot of experience with that yet. But as I mentioned, I could have some worries about how you monitor the real cost of the company.
And just a follow-up on the response that you've given, there's a question that is asking whether there are any government regulations in Denmark to regulate the economic benefits of the privately owned district heating companies, for example, the IRR.
Yeah, well, traditionally, no matter the ownership, the companies have been subject to the same regulation. And that was also what my example showed, that the same price regulation did not work in the same way. It depends on who owns the companies. So that leads back to my point that where you cannot consider the price regulation issue without also considering who should own the companies. So the answer is no, that the same price principle has been applied to all companies in Denmark, but have not worked very well with the private companies.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we're going to, before we go to the next session, we'll take one more question, and this one is for Greg. And the question is asking, do you have any criteria for financing biomass accounting for life cycle emissions of biomass? In other words, do you encourage your clients to implement true renewable solutions like geothermal or solar thermal, even though it might seem more complicated than just replacing a fossil fuel plant with a biomass plant?
Yes, we do have rules surrounding biomass. The broad title is that we want to support projects that would utilize biomass from sustainable sources. But I acknowledge the points there that in some cases the other technologies would be viewed as more complicated, and it perhaps would be viewed as more straightforward to support biomass. But I can say that I don't have the specific policies to hand. Information I could provide afterwards if you want, because it's all published information from the EBRD. But in general, our preference is that biomass project would use what would be considered truly sustainable biomass, sourced within a specific radius and ideally a radius of the facility that will burn at the plant, and of course, where possible, using surplus. So for instance, forest trimmings or forest waste, or waste from existing forestry operations, rather than using virgin wood for supplying, for burning for heat and energy, or burning for heat and power supply. And specifically addressing the solar or geothermal opportunities, we are very eager. We acknowledge that these projects may require additional support, and we are working with our donors to secure support in the form of CapEx grants, specifically targeted at renewable technologies other than biomass.
Thank you very much, Greg, for the responses, and Sorem. Now we are going to go to the next part of the webinar, where we are going to listen to some presentations. The first presentation is from the Netherlands, and it will be presented by Mr. Paul Ramsack, who is a central contact for geothermal energy at the Netherlands Enterprise Agency. He works on innovation funding, market development, policy advice related to geothermal energy, as well as the Dutch National Geothermal Guarantee Scheme. Mr. Ramsack's presentation will be on how to develop enabling frameworks for geothermal heating, and is going to give a case study of the Netherlands. So, Paul, we welcome you to give your presentation.
Thank you very much, Jack. Good morning to all of you out there, or good afternoon, good evening, or even good night, depending on where you are. I hope you are all doing well. My name is Paul Ramsack. I work at the Netherlands Enterprise Agency, or RVO, which is basically the Dutch National Energy Agency and part of the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Policy. Jack, I think you will share the screen, so please bear with us, because this will be a synchronized action running from the Netherlands and Abu Dhabi in parallel, and hopefully in good harmony. So I'm just waiting a few seconds for Jack to upload the presentation, and I will kick it off then. But in the meantime, let me tell you, I guess you all know the Netherlands is not the biggest country in the world, but it's really densely populated with over 70 million of inhabitants. Yeah, please click further, Jack. And that means that we have one of the highest population densities in the world, and for sure in Europe. Next, please. So what I will be trying to do in the next 15 to 20 minutes is giving you a little bit of a picture of where we as a country stand and where we come from, and then where we're heading to, and then zooming in more specifically as an example into our energy transition challenges and the developments with regards to geothermal energy in the Netherlands. Next, please. So I put this graph on as a starter, and actually I think Jack already explained very thoroughly in the beginning this point. And the main point here is that if we look at the energy consumption, and this is the case for Netherlands, but it's true for many other countries as well, the fact is that electricity consumption and transport, for instance, typically only are amounting to a quarter of the total final energy use each, whereas the heating or the heating and cooling sector is the major chunk. That is typically about half or even more of the final energy consumption. Please click, Jack. So the interesting thing is that if we look throughout the world, that still many countries and many incentives and stakeholders are focusing primarily on electricity, on renewable electricity, on transport, but somehow the heating sector, the heating and cooling sector is the big pink elephant in the middle of the room that many people do not see. And if we really want to make an energy transition and a decarbonization happen, then that sector is key. So heating and cooling transition is key in our opinion. And we're working hard in the Netherlands to somehow to facilitate that. So next, please. So looking back into the history of the Netherlands, I think 100 years ago, for instance, the Netherlands, our energy system was based on coal, and we have used that for over 50 years. And then some 50 years ago, in the beginning of the 70s, we turned to natural gas. We found huge reserves in the north of our country, and we rolled out within 10 years an enormous energy transition, the transition from coal to natural gas. That happened very quickly. People couldn't believe it, but they made that change and they adapted to it. Now, funny enough, at the beginning of the new millennium, in the southern city of Heerlen, there were people that took the initiative to do something different, to look under their feet again. And the interesting thing is that this was the heart of the coal mining district in the past. And they came up with the idea to use the water from the flooded coal mines to heat and to cool their city. And what first was just an idea became reality in 2007. They were drilling deep into the old corridors, as deep as 800 meters. And they were successful, and they started to heat their city and also cool their city from the shallower corridors by using this geothermal mine water. And in fact, that was the first geothermal project that was realized in my country. And it is still going on. It's still that initiative that is propelling the energy transition in the old mining district there. Next, please. But soon after that project, also already in 2007, one of our largest farmers, tomato farmers, he approached us and he had this idea of geothermal energy to heat his greenhouses. And also he drilled in 2007, and that became the first successful project with deep geothermal related to the greenhouse sector. So from then on, we would be able to eat the first geothermal tomatoes, and many projects would follow in the years to come. Next, please. And by 2015, we were able to eat our first geothermal strawberries. Next, please. And I don't know whether it was because of the strawberries or because of other reasons, but in the same year, our Minister of Economic Affairs, he basically declared with his government that we should, in the long run, no longer use natural gas to heat our houses. Next, please. But we should look at other sources like, for instance, warm water from the earth, which would of course be geothermal energy. And please realize that the Netherlands is really has been and probably still is to a large extent a gas-based country with our huge reserves that we had. However, we are kind of moving towards a new reality. We are moving into a new transition, and that is really a huge one. Trying to really restructure our heating sector and making the heating transition happen. And I will explain to you how we try to do that and how geothermal will play a role in that. Next, please. So please click further again. So if you look back the last 15 years, you can see that, maybe you go one back, Jack. You can see that we have had a quite rapid development of geothermal energy in the Netherlands. Starting in 2007, we have now reached about 20 plus geothermal projects, producing more than 5 petajoules of geothermal heat in total. Next, please. However, having said that, we haven't by far reached our potential yet. I took this graph from EGEC, the European Geothermal Energy Council, and from their studies, it became clear that more than 25% of the EU population lives in areas that could be directly heated with geothermal district heating. And I guess that the same is true for the Netherlands, and we probably could even reach higher percentages. Next, please. So let me dive into the context of the Netherlands and to the policy instruments that we have developed and we are still developing. I think this development would never have taken place if it had not been for the pioneers, for the cities, for the greenhouse farmers that really had the courage to do something new, to do something different. So that is, I would say, key in all cases. You need brave people that are willing to embark on new roads. However, we always have been trying to help them, and I think these people and these companies and these initiatives should be supported by the national government as well as local governments. And this is exactly what we always try to do and are continuing to try. Next, please. So let me sketch a little bit of the context, let's say the energy policy context. Please click through this slide, Jack. You are all aware of the Paris agreements. And what we did in the Netherlands, we basically translated the Paris agreements into a national climate agreement. Please click. And that climate agreement was agreed upon last year. And the goals agreed upon were a reduction of 95% in 2050. And that is, I think, the even more ambitious one. Please click, a reduction of almost 50% of CO2 emissions in 10 years from now, in 2030. And the way we tackle this is we divided our society into 5 sectors: agriculture, industry, the built environment, electricity generation, and mobility. And then we looked what kind of sources would be available. And if you look into geothermal, in the Netherlands, geothermal, we are not a high enthalpy country. So definitely geothermal electricity generation is not that logical. However, yeah, number 12, yes, thank you. However, to heat our greenhouses, to heat our cities, and to heat parts of the industry, geothermal can be a very good source. Please click. Yeah, and continue. One more. So, based on that climate agreement, we have defined different activities. And please bear in mind that we should already reduce 50% in 10 years from now. So one action, for instance, please click, is the phasing out of coal-fired electricity production by 2030. But then turning to the agricultural sector, we have decided that the greenhouses should be heated in a sustainable way in future. And for a large part, that will probably be by geothermal heat. Now for the built environment, we have decided, please click, we have decided that for new buildings, for new areas, we should no longer use natural gas to heat them. And at the same time, for the existing ones, municipalities should lead a local participative approach to make housing emission free on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. Next, please. So zooming into the built environment sector, these are the challenges we are facing. By 2050, we need to decouple 7 million houses plus 1 million other buildings from gas, what we call van gaslos. So we need to find an alternative for the natural gas heating we have now. And by 2030, we should already do that with 1.5 million existing houses. And as said, the approach we are taking is this neighborhood by neighborhood approach, where the central government, where we try to support municipalities to develop these plans, these heating transition plans. And already next year, there should be draft versions in which they indicate which neighborhoods should be tackled when, involving also interactions with their residents. One other interesting factor is that we will close down our huge Groningen gas field already by 2022. One more click, please. So one more. So you can see in the north of the country, you can see the subsidence because of the gas extraction over the last 50 years. And because of many issues that were caused by that, the political decision has been made to phase out that gas production from the biggest field. And that will turn the Netherlands from a net exporter of gas into a gas importing country. And now interesting dynamics come into play, because if you need to import fossil fuels, you're in a different game. And you can ask yourself whether it would not be much wiser to go for local solutions and domestic solutions instead of paying money to the outside world and being dependent on the outside world. And this is really triggering the transition and propelling the use of geothermal heat. Now, what kind of alternatives do we have? This was already addressed by Jack, but basically you can either solve it individually or through a district heating network. And typically in cities, the collective option, the district heating option, is the more efficient and the more economic one. And in terms of sources, you can see that geothermal and geothermal combined with thermal energy storage, probably in the underground, possibly combined with other renewables like solar, is a very logical one. So we see more and more, please click, geothermal being put on the agenda, combinations with geothermal energy storage. And also we see a transition from the traditional high temperature district heating towards medium temperature and lower temperature grids, as they are much more flexible. Next, please. So in terms of geothermal in the built environment, I think we can say that by 2050, the share of district heating, the potential share, might be substantial, somewhere in the range from I would say 25 to 50%. The geothermal will be one of the major sources for district heating in the Netherlands. However, we need to develop the district heating grids because otherwise we cannot make that transition happen. And here we also are still learning, I would say, from other countries like Denmark. And I think that the previous presentation was especially interesting because we are working at the moment on a heating law that should regulate the heating market. And as we've seen from the example from Denmark, that is also a crucial element to make the district heating development happen. At the moment, we have quite some geothermal projects, but most of them are connected to greenhouses. Actually, only one district heating is providing heating to a city, the Minewater project in Heerlen. Having said that, however, many city projects, geothermal heating projects in cities are in the pipeline, and we expect that the situation will be quite different in a few years from now. The policy goals, they are ambitious. We're now at 5 petajoules, but you can see that in the climate agreement, we're already heading for 20 in 2030, and well over 100 by 2050. And the master plan that was developed by the sector itself is even more ambitious. Next, please. Next. So if you then look into the situation we are in, this map gives a nice overview of the projects that are already existing, well spread over the country, although we have a concentration in our largest greenhouse areas. Please click further. And these projects, they typically get the heat from between 2 and 3 kilometers depth at 70 to 90 degrees. But at the moment, we are also looking deeper, deeper than 4 kilometers in what we call ultra deep geothermal. Please click. And if that would become a reality, we would be able to reach higher temperatures and supply larger parts of industry. But we're also looking into shallower aquifers between 500 and 1500 meters. And the advantage of that is that they're available in many more places than the traditional ones. And they could well be combined with low temperature district heating networks in cities. Next. So basically, the policy that we are following with regard to geothermal is to strengthen the existing instruments and to accelerate. And let me use the last few minutes to highlight the most important instruments we have. And I would say the 5 most important here. Next, please. Or the 2 central ones and the 2 oldest ones are the Geothermal Guarantee Scheme and the SDE Plus. The guarantee scheme is a public guarantee scheme to cover the geological risk of geothermal projects. We are handling that at RVO over the last 10 years. And having such a scheme, I think, is crucial in any place, because there's always a geological risk attached to geothermal. And unless if you have very deep pockets and are willing to take that risk yourself, you will find it hard to find banks or other investors to invest in risky projects. So with that national guarantee scheme, we are able to cover that risk to a large extent, up to 85% of the investment. And that really has propelled, let's say, the takeoff of geothermal. Then the other thing is the SDE Plus. That is basically a subsidy scheme for the production of renewable energy. And as you are aware, many countries do have some kind of subsidy support for renewables. However, in most of the cases, or in many of the cases, it's only supporting renewable electricity in feed-in tariff schemes, for instance. What we did, we made it broadly applicable to any form of renewables, so including renewable heat and including, therefore, geothermal. And that makes sure that geothermal is competitive with fossil alternatives, and that really gave a boost to the project initiatives. So you can see there are over 40 projects in total now, so many are in the pipeline already, and we expect to be heading for the 2030 goals if all these projects will be realized, and basically the subsidies are for a large part already in place. Next, please. So apart from the risk guarantee and the subsidy scheme, I think 2 other things are very important. And one is about subsurface data. In the Netherlands, all the mining data becomes public after 5 years, after a period of 5 years. So any data on drillings, on seismic survey, etc., is being gathered by our ministry and is being made available on a website that is online. And I put the link here. It's called nlog.nl. You can browse that yourself, and you will see there's a wealth of data collected over the last 100 years in the Netherlands, and it's all publicly available. And the good thing about that is that if you want to start a geothermal initiative in the Netherlands, you can really kickstart it by having all the data that is around available. On top of that, we're also running a seismic survey, a public campaign to focus or to get more knowledge about the wide areas we still had in the Netherlands. Next, please. So I just showed here a screenshot. It should be coming up. Next, please. Yes, you can see here the NLOG website screenshot with all the boreholes that are present, all the seismic data. Please go to the website and browse there yourself. And if there are any questions, let me know. Next, please. And to complement, I would say, the underground instrument, we have another initiative called the Center of Expertise for Heat and the Heat Atlas. The Center of Expertise for Heat is basically a national knowledge center for heat transition in the built environment. This is located at our institute at RVO. And here we support all the municipalities that are now in the phase of thinking and acting on the heating transition in their municipalities. And one tool, for instance, we developed here, you can see, and it's also available online, so you can browse it, is the Heat Atlas, Warmte Atlas Nederland. And here we have gathered all the demand side data from the built environment, but also from greenhouses and industry, and coupled it to all the supply side data in terms of potentials, waste heat, etc. So that is really a very good tool for municipalities and also for us to help municipalities to make their transition plans. Next, please. And then, last but not least, I think an important thing, an important instrument is the support of innovation. And that is really crucial, I would say. We need new technology, we need new concepts, innovative concepts, and we need to demonstrate them. We need to bring them to the market. Please click. Oh. And the thing is that we are doing that, and we have several support schemes to do that on different TRL levels. So I think that is really important to make geothermal robust, affordable, and widely applicable, and in that way be able to support the heating transition we are aiming for. What I should also mention here is that we are not doing that alone. We also try to cooperate Europe-wide as much as possible. We were one of the initiators of an initiative between European member states called Geothermica, where about half of Europe is cooperating specifically on geothermal energy. And recently also the US have joined that initiative. So to sum up and to reach my conclusions, next please. I think that the largest challenge in front of us, definitely in the Netherlands, is the heat transition. We need really a large-scale demonstration and implementation to show what can be done, and we need innovation for that. Next, please. But on top of that, we also need a vision. I think nationally it's very important if you know what you're heading for, if you have the heat transition on the map, and if you then know where, for instance, geothermal can play a role. And for the Netherlands, next please, we have decided that it is about geothermal food. So it's about the tomatoes and the strawberries and all the greenhouses. where we should make the transition. It's about our cities where the transition should take place. Next, please. And it's about parts of our industry. And I really would hope that soon I would be able to share some geothermal cheese with you. But up to then, we have to do it with the Italian geothermal cheese. And that brings me, I think, to the last, or the one before the last slide. I think we can only, please click, do this and make this transition happen if we do it together. So we really need all of you. We need industry, we need research, but we also need the public authorities on all the different levels, be it national, be it regional, or be it local. We already try to cooperate within the Geothermica framework with mostly European countries. Click, please. But I think we should enlarge that cooperation, and we should really learn much more from each other. I think the good thing about geothermal is that it's always local for local. So you're not depending on other people. But having said that, it is very wise to cooperate with other people, to learn from each other, to align visions, to align strategies, and also to really do hands-on projects together. And I think for that, Geothermica, but also the Global Geothermal Alliance and IRENA would already be well positioned. And yeah, happy to help you out if you have any ideas about that, especially the ones that are active at national or also local governments. Next, please. So with that, I think I have reached the end of my presentation. Yes. Thank you very much for your attention. Stay safe, take care, and I'll give the floor back to Jack.
So thank you very much, Paul, for your presentation. Now we are going to have our last presentation for today, and it will be presented by Dr. Marit Brommer. Dr. Marit Brommer is the Executive Director for the International Geothermal Association since 2017, where she has been working with partners in renewable energy to make geothermal play a more substantial role in the future energy mix. She brings with her a wealth of experience from her previous job in the oil and gas sector, including on technology deployment and geoscience portfolio management. So Dr. Brommer, I'm going to give the floor to you to give us your presentation.
Thank you, and Jack, thank you very much for this very kind introduction, but also the invitation to speak in your webinar. A very good morning, well, still morning here in Germany. Good afternoon and good evening as well, if you are still around in that late hour of the day. A delight to speak here today. Very quick on the IGA, in case you haven't heard of the IGA, we are the International Geothermal Association, and we are a New Zealandic-based registered society, but we operate in Germany from the city in Bonn. We have about 60 countries who join us in their mission to put geothermal on their national map, whether we come from the power, the heating and cooling segments, direct use such as the hot spring industry, but also the heat pumps, and trying to deploy that technology across the globe. That is our true mission. Today, I've been asked to share some views and the perspectives from the industry who are ready and able to serve the district heating networks with the geothermal resource. Hence, my subtitle, it is really trying to get across what the industry sees as the barriers, the challenges, but also aiming to get some solutions off the ground. I like the previous speakers, in the sense that I fully agree that we need a global, or at least a cross-boundary strategy when we're talking geothermal. It is local to local, but at the end of the day, in partnership, we will see those big challenges ahead of us to be implemented on the ground. The UN Sustainable development goal, and especially number 7, is of course at the heart of the geothermal mission, because we want to provide not only robust and resilient, but also affordable, and it has to be clean energy to people. If you look at the demand for energy, it's clear that the heating and cooling needs is approximately 50% of the energy consumption worldwide. But decarbonization of that heating and cooling market is still one of the biggest challenges ahead of us. And industry and enabling, let's say, industry to play its part, whether they come from a more mining, extractive industry, oil and gas approach, or the clean tech that's ready out there to serve this mission to decarbonize the heating and cooling market, is still a long journey ahead. And one of the things that I think we should first do is getting the data right. I Googled for district heating, and I found, of course, many beautiful organizations that are trying to push the district heating, let's say, notion, associations such as Euroheat and Power, including my own organization, trying to push the notion that, you know, the renewable transition is about heating and cooling, and why not look in depth at those district heating networks. I found a publication in 2017 that I think illustrates the point quite well, that there are apparently, let's say, 3 dominant nationals, or let's say the European Union as a whole, 3 dominant category countries who are really have installed district heating networks. The rest of the world, including the United States, Korea, Ukraine, etc., they are still having district heating systems in place, but they are still limited when it compares to the big 3 categories. So for us at the IGA and our industry that we're trying to, let's say, serve with the mission to implement more of these technologies in that district heating category, it's clear that we look at Europe, to a certain degree Russia, but that's still very limited. And China is, of course, a very interesting country for the IGA to be involved in. Why are we interested in it? It's clear that the need for district heating to transform its predominantly fossil fuel-based energy source to a more renewable one, that geothermal fits in there. The infrastructure needs to be mapped also for us in order to understand that there is a close connection between the source, because inherently that is always going to be our starting point. A good, maybe low temperature, but a good resource is needed to be served in that wider industry perspective of putting wells to the ground to serve heating networks. And hence the role of geothermal, it is also about making district heating resilient. Energy efficiency is, of course, a measure that we take to our heart. And if you look at the potential for geothermal, it is still immense, because on average, what I can see is that we have around 400 gigawatt thermal heat supplied through DH systems. And let's say 90% of that is still fossil fuel based. So there's a huge market and a huge potential. Dominant countries, China, Russia to a certain degree, but as I said, it's very limited, our knowledge and our position in Russia, and Europe. Those are the dominant, let's say, category regions and countries that we as IGA want to focus on in the foreseeable future. If you look at the present state of play, geothermal district heating, in yellow, I've mapped the countries who have, in one way or the other, implemented geothermal in their district heating networks. China, very recently, let's say the joint venture of Arctic Green and Sinopec has clearly accelerated the implementation of the district heating networks through geothermal. Turkey, another country that has taken it at the heart of its energy transition, geothermal, and hence what you see is a large, let's say, acceleration again in seeing geothermal implemented in their district heating networks. And of course, the more mature countries such as Iceland is the leader of the pack. But Germany, I saw a beautiful picture of Paul Ramsack at the end. That's the city of Munich. I think they are the leading city when it comes down to allowing geothermal play a role in cleaning up their, let's say, district heating network through renewables. But France and Hungary are one of the oldest countries as well who allow geothermal to play a role in their district heating network. We see upcoming movement in, let's say, the Eastern European countries, a fantastic achievement in Finland with the deepest well drilled, 6.9 kilometers in a relatively cold area, geothermally cold, but you have to go deep and then you get that heat transferred into the city of Helsinki. Denmark, of course, is key. Right, they have put a very nice vision on how geothermal can help, and the Netherlands, as Paul was already explaining, they even mapped it into their strategic roadmap for how to transform their energy system, which was basically by, let's say, supplied by natural gas, into a more geothermal resourced structure. So the newcomers, they share the vision of seeing geothermal as a potential game changer for cleaning up their district heating networks. But they are countries who have an established district heating network. So the real challenge is, of course, if there is no network in place yet, how can we tap into that, let's say, geothermal work base? That is a bridge too far at this moment. We are currently really concentrating on those countries who have existing infrastructure in place and trying to understand the barriers and the solutions to overcome that. Just one word on who we are and where we convene. We are IEGA. We give global updates. So one of the data sets that I've been giving you is on our global updates that we usually give out at our World Geothermal Conference, which happens every 3 years and was supposed to be taking place this year in Iceland, but due to COVID-19, we are now convening in 2021. May 21 to 26 in Reykjavik in Iceland. And one of the topics, one of the big themes and priority settings on that conference is going to be about the heating and cooling transition, and especially enabling green cities through the geothermal resource. If you look at our sector in numbers, very briefly, we are active in 94 countries. When you really look at direct use, we are implementing geothermal in one way or the other across 94 countries, which is approximately half of the world. We've created, according to IRENA in 2019, around 100,000 jobs. We have 300 power plants in 35 countries. We have an installed capacity 15 gigawatt electric, and in total we're serving 75 gigawatt thermal to the world. And we're not just serving Sustainable Development Goal 7 when it comes down to affordable energy. We fundamentally believe that we are, in our resource mindset, we are serving also the notion of clean and sustainable cities through district heating networks, sustainable food through our greenhouses, good tourism, and hence the infrastructure that you need in terms of Sustainable Development Goal number 9, when we're talking about the industry and decarbonizing the industry as a whole. Today, the focus is on direct use capacity. Again, what we take from our World Update reports, we can split the direct use capacity currently installed across the globe in 2 categories. One is the heat pumps, and as you can see, that has seen a fantastic uptake in the past, let's say 10 years, moving from around 33 megawatt thermal to about 50, which is almost a 50% increase. And expected for this year is another big acceleration of the uptake of heat pumps across the world. Direct use, on the other hand, if you look at the 5 past years, 20 megawatt thermal installed in 15, now approximately planned for 2020 is 27 to have direct use installed. And this is not just district heating, this is not just the geothermal, this is indeed the aggregated installed capacity across the world when we talk about geothermal direct use for greenhouses, hot springs, direct use of for swimming pools, but also district heating purposes. If we look at that, and again, this comes from our World Status Update, if we look at that, we see 2 dominant regions who have indeed implemented geothermal in their district heating network. And on average, it's 50-50 when it comes down to how much installed capacity do we have now. China in red, around 4 gigawatt thermal, and let's say the wider European region of those ones who are contributing the most is around 4 gigawatt thermal as well, meaning that in total we have around 8 gigawatt thermal installed, which compared to the overall, let's say, contribution to the district heating network, which is around 400 gigawatt thermal, we are still a very small player. From an industry perspective, and again, this is from a global and maybe even a more European, let's say, transboundary and a bigger vision for industry players to play a role as an enabler in that energy transition. What are those barriers? And also, how can we reach to certain solutions when we want to achieve that decarbonized heating and cooling system? First and foremost, for an industry point of view, it is always very important to look at how are the companies and who owns, let's say, that heat market. And what you can see is that basically, if you look at heat suppliers across the globe, this is very rough distinction between the public sector owning the heat utility companies, if you want to call that a company, and privately owned companies. So roughly 20-80. 80% is public, only 20% is private. Previous presenters also said heat is local. That's not a barrier in itself, but the fact if you want to do transboundary business, understanding that you still will have to run a business case on a local, let's say, project that requires understanding the local market conditions when it comes down from the legal point of view, the regulating point of view. Is there at all a feed-in tariff also for the heat market? It is difficult for a global player to just step their feet for one single project in one single country. So what you tend to see within the 20% private companies is that the majority of them serve the local proposition of geothermal, meaning that it is, from a global perspective and maybe from a European perspective as well, it's not really clear how to set the business case because the market conditions vary. Maybe not even national, but also regional. Take Germany as an example with 16, let's say, counties. The market conditions may vary from county, so Bundesland, to other county. So what industry really needs, and this is also something we advocate for on behalf of the IEGA and with our sister organization in Brussels and with the wider, let's say, worldview that we have in China, for instance, as well, is that we advocate for a strategy. And I take the example here from rock to radiator, just to make sure that we are dealing here with an entire supply chain and an entire value chain in order to get the resource out of the ground, get it dispatched into the grid or into, let's say, a distribution center so that it can arrive in people's homes or in the buildings that you want to serve. And for that, there are 4 blocks of, let's say, barriers combined with solutions that I want to, let's say, talk about in my next coming 5 minutes. First and foremost, the legal status, legislation. It is key to understand for an industry point of view, what is the legal entity of the resource? I'll come to that in a sec. Regulation. We can talk about regulation when it comes down to market conditions, but also bear in mind, as geothermal is classified in certain cases as an extractive resource, someone needs to regulate how that resource is extracted. Hence, if you don't have a regulatory regime in a country specifically pertaining to extracting a resource off the ground, it's very difficult to get your geothermal mapped into the district heating vision of a city or a municipality. Standardization is another key area for the IGA to work on, because if an industry doesn't know how to comply to certain standards and then, let's say, prototyping its way in every single project, it's very difficult to share those lessons learned, as my previous speaker was talking about, and share technology transfer and really become, let's say, technical innovators. We have to understand what the baseline is, meaning international standards that people can adhere to, coming from, let's say, well design, risk, mitigation of risk, ethics, being compliant to the environmental, let's say, law. We can standardize that, and we need to standardize that. And part of the mission of the IGA as well, it's simple awareness raising, capacity building. People sometimes, as a city, let's say municipality administrator, don't know geothermal. They understand solar, they understand biomass, but geothermal is still relatively new when it comes down to planning and seeing geothermal as a viable resource and technology enabler for a cleaner city. So awareness raising also from an industry perspective is absolute paramount. I just want to step out for a bit and look at how the European Green Deal deals with certain strategic frameworks and strategic roadmaps and how they address in a communication, let's say, around sustainability and driving the energy transition forward. And I took the example, and I will talk about that with that, in terms of looking at a specific part of the supply chain when it comes down to agriculture. The generic here and the generic lessons learned also for geothermal, what I want to advocate for is that there is a EU bill on the table. It still needs to be ratified. I am aware of that. But the bill will ensure a legislative framework, for instance, for a supply chain to kick in. There is a budget, so people allocate money to ensure capital, because at the end of the day, if the drill bit needs to drill, someone needs to pay for that, piece of work, meaning we need to get capital into projects. And then the EU sets a strategy, and they call that from farm to fork when it comes down to the agriculture value chain. And what they do is they have targets such as 40% of the common policy should contribute to climate action. And for instance, 30% of a certain thing should be funded through climate objectives. We can do something similar. We should be doing something similar. We should have this, statement coming from the current president of the European Commission that says working with all member states is key. These national strategic plans, in this case for agriculture, but you could say here, district heating systems, should fully reflect the ambition of the EGDs, or the European Green Deal. My point here is we don't have a common strategy when we're talking in Brussels. Geothermal is not yet mentioned as part of the solution when it comes down to ensuring clean cities throughout Europe. It is mentioned in certain cases for very nice R&D challenges, and I think it is great, as my previous speaker was saying that as well, that's already on the table. The heat transition is on the table. But if you really want to look at the entire ecosystem for geothermal, from rock to radiator, we need to get such similar, let's say, talking points in the strategic documents that are currently to be ratified, of course, under the legislative framework. And that, if we have that, and I mentioned here global between brackets because this can also be EU, but these global, let's say, items and barriers are still on the table. Because if I look at the 4 items, the 4 themes that the IGA wants to work on with its industry partners, look at legislation. If we have an EU bill or a global bill that says we understand what geothermal resources are, because is it mining or is it even renewable? We don't have to fight every time at the national level to make that, let's say, a discussion. When we are a legal entity in terms of a mining entity, or if geothermal is renewable, because in certain cases people say, well, you re-inject the water, hence is that really renewable? If you don't re-inject, what happens with the resource? What I'm saying here is, if we want to get a contribution from the national indicators, we need to be a legal entity, and we need to have geothermal mapped into the legislative framework. Regulation is very similar. The role of the regulator. Are there regulations in place? How do people regulate the mining law, for instance, if heat is seen as a mining resource, a to be mined resource? Legislation and regulation, with those things, we really work very well together with our global partners, such as IRENA and the Global Geothermal Alliance, because this is key to get across on a transnational level and seeking understanding for what geothermal actually is and how to regulate it from a technical point of view. The third point and the fourth point are really in the hands of the IEGA and our global membership, because improved data collection, getting the data out there, set international standards that we all can comply with and adhere to, that is something, a priority thing for the IEGA to work on. And the same thing goes for awareness raising, so capacity building, training. Upcoming countries who don't know geothermal should be trained, should be built into their, the capacity building workshop, facilitating. I can easily imagine that for global, let's say, for sustainable global cities, not every city council understands how best different technologies work in their, different jurisdiction, and hence the IEGA very much advocates and tries to help, of course, in that capacity building approach. In terms of standardization, we've taken the initiative to launch our, what we call the Global Geothermal Ambassadors Program. It is difficult to get data of certain countries. It is less difficult in the well-established countries with whom we have a long-standing relationship. But in those countries who are still relatively new, we find it difficult to get actual data of what the situation is on the ground. So we draw in on our wide network of people and volunteers, operators, company representatives, national planners, etc. And we're building this state-of-the-art database, still under construction, of course. And we have a very nice peer review process implemented in order to have that, global authority when it comes down to data. And that will lead in, obviously, to standardization, because the way we collect data must be standardized as well. It must be coherent, and it must be following a certain template so that everybody understands that we're talking about the same things. And second initiative that we've launched, we're working for a very long time already with the UN, and especially the UN EC, so the Economic Commission for Europe. And we have developed under the classification project of the UN geothermal specifications. We are working on deploying the specifications together with IRENA and the World Bank Group, and of course the UNEC, because it's a comprehensive system that provides not only the coherent and reliable data, but it's also globally comparable. And what we're trying to do here is a very difficult approach towards classifying renewables, but basically trying to draw out the status of the project according to 3 dimensions. Is the project feasible? How much do we know about the subsurface? De-risking basically that. And what's the viability when it comes down to the socio-economic aspects? Now, you can easily imagine that the geological knowledge is something people know very well when they work in the geothermal resource industry, but feasibility is a key driver, of course, for implementation. If you're not market ready, there will be no geothermal prospect, or let's say even a project in the pipeline. And the same goes for permitting and licenses. Is there an off-taker? That all needs to be mapped according to these 3 dimensions. And the beauty of the UNFC is that it's comparable to solar, wind, biomass, and hydropower. And equally, it's comparable to oil, gas, coal, meaning for an investor, it's quite interesting to understand what comparable and hence opportunities there are to invest in certain projects when you can compare it between the technologies, renewable, but also the fossil fuel ones. So we're very happy that we see this strong collaboration together with IRENA and the GGA and with the World Bank Group, because we fundamentally believe that trying to get more capital into geothermal development is key for success. So I'm convinced in my, let's say, concluding statement is that we will achieve a decarbonized heating and cooling system, but we really need this coherent strategic roadmap. We're very willing to work on certain themes that we can have, let's say, control on. We believe that our industry partners are the technology enablers. They are the ones who understand heating, they understand cooling, they understand how they fit in terms of that resource-driven mindset when it comes down to cleaning up the district heating network. But it also requires all of us to work on a coherent legislation and a coherent regulatory regime. And hence this energy transformation and the role of geothermal is indeed a truly collaborative approach, for which I am very keen to, well, to see this webinar as one of the outcomes of this coherent approach. So I want to thank you for engaging, and also if you want to know more about the IEDA or want to know more about all our initiatives, then of course you can follow us online. And I wholeheartedly invite you to come to Iceland for our World Geothermal Conference in May 2021. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marit, for that very good presentation. Now I see we've overrun our time, but we will go to some quick questions that I have received. And to start us off, it's a question about the public acceptability of geothermal projects, that they seem to have a lot of negative perceptions by the public and the policymakers. So in this regard, what is the geothermal industry doing to address the negative perceptions of geothermal energy? Marit, maybe you can respond to that.
Yeah, sorry, I was. I think we were we were unmuting and muting. Yeah. Yes, a very good point. I think the public perception of geothermal is very much dependent on where you are, let's say, raised, and I say that with a specific notion, and I'll come to that. But also what you hear about it in the news. So if I go to, for instance, the country Hungary, and if I talk about, you know, are people perceiving geothermal as a risk, it's very clear that people really embrace geothermal because they are raised with it. They see it. They see the steam coming out of the fields. They have a willingness to work with it. It's culturally ingrained in the way they look at geothermal. Very similar in Iceland, New Zealand, those typical hot countries when it comes down to understanding the hot. I mean, the hot rock country. In other countries where it is seen as a to be drilled resource and you can't really see it, this is where, you know, facts and perception kicks in. I think communication here is key. I can clearly see that in certain countries there is more opposition than in others. I think maybe Paul can shed some light on the Netherlands, but I do think that even there is a strong willingness to look at geothermal, even, you know, from the risky point of view. In Switzerland, I can see, you know, we had an incident, a seismic incident in Basel 5-6 years ago, but people are still now developing geothermal because people realize it is one part of the solution, and if you communicate it effectively, and if you take this holistic approach towards embracing geothermal as a green technology that can help, and that you make it a community owning, let's say, perception of the resource, those are clear drivers for accepting, let's say, geothermal in your backyard, basically. But it's a valid point. It is hard work because communication is sometimes overlooked as a strategic, let's say, enabler of a project. But I bet the wind and solar industry will do the same in terms of effective communication when it is about, you know, the not in my backyard connotation. But thank you for the question. Very good.
Thank you very much. And the second question is asking, and this is directed to Paul, should the national governments define a share that district heating should have in the national heat supply?
Sorry, Jack, I just missed the question or part of the question. Could you repeat it, please?
Yes, the question is asking whether the national government should define the share that district heating should have in national heat supply.
Right, thank you for that question. Well, it's an interesting point, whether that should be defined nationally. The path we follow at the moment in the Netherlands, that basically we give a lot of authority to the local communities, but we support them nationally. So they are the ones that are closest to their cities, to their inhabitants. and they are probably the ones that can best judge what kind of systems are feasible and wanted in their cities and in their neighborhoods. At the same time, we try to support them from a national level as good as possible with objective data. And clearly, if you are in inner cities, in higher density areas, like Jack already, like you presented, Jack, typically district heating is the more efficient solution. So if you consider that natural gas is no longer an option, and this is the situation we are in, then you either have to turn to individual solutions or collective solutions. Individual solutions would typically be more expensive, and also not everyone can afford them. So definitely in cities, I would think that collective solutions like district heating and cooling should play a major role. Now, whether it's then the government on a national level that should define the goals, that is to be discussed. That could be the case, but I think to do that in close cooperation with the regions and with the cities might be a very good approach as well. And maybe on top of that, if you then look into the resources, I think the good thing about, for instance, geothermal or the underground is that everybody has it. Maybe not in all cases the same quality of geothermal resource, but it is always a local thing you have. So you're not depending on for instance, biomass imports, where you also have huge sustainability discussions taking place. So these are all things to consider. And having said that, I think on top of that, also the use of the underground as a storage, for instance, to store solar energy from summer into winter time, or to store the coolness, let's say, of the winter and to store it into the summer, that can also be a role of the subsurface. So we should be way more open in looking into concepts and solutions.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that response. And just to respond to one of the questions that is being asked by one of the participants, whether geothermal is hot enough to provide heating, I would want to point out that what we are looking into is how we can incorporate the low temperature renewable energy sources such as geothermal, such as solar thermal, and even other much lower temperature sources into district heating networks. And for us to be able to do this, then we are advocating for the change for modification and retrofitting of the district heating networks and also the existing buildings, so that they become compatible with the low temperature resources. In addition to that, we have other technologies like the heat pumps, which can be used to boost the temperature of the geothermal and other low temperature resources, so that they're able to meet the heating needs of the building. Now, these are questions, together with other technical questions about how to address the challenges of geothermal, will be addressed during our last webinar, which we are going to announce very shortly. And maybe to bring an end to this question and answer session, given that the time has gone too much, I would want Paul to address a question on how effective has the geothermal risk guarantee been in Netherlands with respect to the development of geothermal resources? So maybe we can take this as our last question, and then we conclude.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jack, for that question. I do think that having a geothermal risk mitigation solution, let's put it that way, is crucial everywhere. And definitely in the Netherlands, it was very important that there was a governmental solution for mitigating that risk to get things started. And I think what we see now developing is that, for instance, in some areas where there is already more knowledge about the underground and more experience with successful projects, that people can take that risks themselves, or that even commercial insurers are stepping in. However, at the same time, in new areas where we haven't so much experience, we see that market parties are still quite hesitant to start up and to take that risk. And for instance, you know, typically it's not getting the money that is the issue. I mean, any bank will lend you money if they are sure that it's not at risk. So it's the risk that you have to mitigate. And as the geological risk is a key thing, I would say, in geothermal project, yeah, it's wise to have a solution at hand. And we see many countries following up on that and also starting these risk mitigation schemes recently.
So thank you very much to all the panelists and to all the participants for taking your time to join us during this webinar. Now we've come to the end of it, and we are going to have the presentations available at the end of the webinar. We're also going to share the presentations with everybody. So the presentations and the recording will be shared on the IRENA webinar, on the IRENA YouTube channel, as well as on the websites of the Global Geothermal Alliance, and also on the website of IRENA. Now we've come to the end of the webinar, and the next one, which will be focusing on the technical challenges on how to address the technical challenges of integrating low temperature renewable energy sources, will take place in a few weeks, and we're going to share the details as soon as possible. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And as you log out, please remember to respond to the survey that is going to appear on your screens when you close the application. So thank you very much and have a good afternoon.